This is the questions and answers and discussion comment. Please do identify yourself for the benefit of our panelists, and uh, there will be, I believe, microphones available. So floor is open to you to ask any questions or make any comments. If there are comments, please make it brief. And our panelists, if you wish, you can direct the question to a particular person. So the floor is open.
Thank you very much. My name is Brigadier Dick Prit Olum from Uganda Army. My question is directed to the Professor, School of...
Could you please repeat?
I repeat, my question is directed to the Professor, School of Economics, London. It's a great challenge considering the global threat today, and I would like to refer to what he mentioned under United Nations having done nothing so far. There is a notion that the UN is a US or a UK and other European countries' interest. It is also agreeable to what you indicated as the UN having done nothing for some time. When you look at the situations where UN is involved in Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, and currently in Somalia, you see a lot of challenges that the international community and the UN bodies face and the failures as indicated by you. Professor, I would like you to highlight what your views are on the way forward, especially on an immediate action by the UN in cleaning its name that's already dented. Thank you.
Switched on? Oh, it is on. Well, thank you very much for that question. If I can just clarify what I was saying, I haven't said the United Nations has done nothing. I was saying the United Nations has not fulfilled the expectations that people have of it. And perhaps it's important to explain why, in order to see what the road further, or the road forward would be. I mean, there are many explanations. You've mentioned it as a kind of Anglo-American conspiracy. Well, the problem is the United States, for a very long time, didn't take the United Nations very seriously, and particularly in the Bush years, from 2001 to 2006. It sidelined the UN. You may remember that the UN inspectors were expelled from Iraq, even though they asked that they could stay longer to complete the actual mission, which might have resulted in the fact that we would have discovered there were no weapons of mass destruction. Russia is another very important factor. It's blocked a lot of initiatives in the Security Council on Syria, for example. It's ensured that there cannot be a sustained UN response. Its role has been that of a spoiler, to be an obstructor for its own purposes. We have a very uninspirational Secretary General. And the UN traditionally, historically, has always taken a lead from the strength of the Secretary General. You've had some strong Secretary Generals like Kofi Annan, and you've had some weak Secretary Generals, and I think we have a weak one at the moment. And then you have the fact that Europe hasn't always taken the United Nations very seriously. We had a war in Kosovo in 1999, which did not have the UN Security Council mandate. That war was probably, if you ask a lot of international lawyers, illegal. But then, of course, we justified it in the sense that we didn't need legality on our side. We had legitimacy on our side. And there is a tendency, I think, for regional associations to define security and even morality in regional terms. You may be familiar with the concept of the Russian near abroad. That is, within the Russian sphere of influence, there's a set of countries that in the end, Russia determines their future. But there's also a European near abroad. It's the Balkans. Everything that happens in the Balkans is largely determined by Brussels these days. So that is a set of explanations for why the United Nations is not exactly perhaps performing optimally as we might hope, not necessarily expect. I always remember the United Nations was described by one academic as being the first institution in history to be indispensable before it became useful. So ultimately, we've often challenged the utility of the UN, but we've also accepted the indispensability of the UN because there's nothing else to replace it. So your question is an extremely timely one. Now you're asking for solutions. Unfortunately for my fellow panelists, I have no solutions. I'm not paid to have solutions. I'm only paid to identify problems. If I had the solutions, I would give you my private bank account number and we could do a deal outside this forum, but I haven't. But I hope in identifying the problems, you may be able to find some solutions packed in there.
Thank you very much. I'm in good company, I can see. Thank you very much. Any other colleagues wishing to respond? Dr.
I think the problems have been very well identified, and indispensability of the United Nations also has been emphasized. The solution, as I mentioned in my remarks, is really to make it broad-based. I think we have to start with the reform of the United Nations Security Council, because a lot of the all the security decisions are taken in the United Nations Security Council. Actually, the solutions have been identified in the reports which were brought out early this century under Kofi Annan, and when a new set of security threats were considered, identified, and what should be done within the United Nations was also identified, and some action has been taken. So it's really the political will that is required. If the permanent five are able to agree on a common course of action, I think a lot of things can happen, but that is still not happening. And one can hope only that at the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, some forward movement can be shown, because there are a number of solutions that is possible.
Thank you very much. Someone who had worked at the United Nations, not with the United Nations, but worked at the United Nations, I just wanted to add that it's true that the strong Secretary General can provide a contribution or even make a difference, but it is often said, like Dr. Arvind Gupta was saying, that the UN by itself as an institution cannot do much. It can do what the member states want it to do, nothing more or nothing less. So it's the question of the political will, especially of the permanent members of the Security Council. Are there further questions? Yes, please.
Sir, I am Brigadier Rafiqur Rahman from Pakistan Army. Just a small remark. Well, we understand that virtually in today's world there is no space for the conventional armed conflict, and that is the reason, unfortunately, the world, all the global competitors are basically resorting to non-kinetic means, and more unfortunately, certain violent part of the non-kinetic mean to achieve their political motives and objectives, and that is to secure their national interests. But sir, having said this, during this process, the terrorism has come to intense spotlight, but unfortunately, a very important conclusion we have certainly lost sight of is the legitimate political movements, the freedom movements, which basically lie at the core of these threats. Like to mention the Kashmir problem, which is unresolved, and you can, as people very often attribute a lot of problems or the emerging terrorism from this. Similarly, the Palestine issue, which is a legitimate global issue, but unfortunately people lose sight of the problem and try to address the other peripheral issues. So I would like comments from the panel on this aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was a comment than a question, but if any one of you wish to make an observation on it. Dr.
I think there is a increasing realization that terrorism is now a threat to everyone, right from the individual to international order. And if you see the large number of joint statements which are issued after conferences, in after the bilateral visits and so on, they clearly say that terrorism cannot be justified on any grounds. Now, if that kind of a consensus emerges that terrorism cannot be justified on any grounds, and if all the problems that you have to have, if there are any problems, they must be resolved, not through terrorist means, but through dialogue, then there is a way in which to handle this. So I think this issue of mixing up terrorism with freedom movements and those kind of issues is only going to make things more complicated, and more terrorism is going to come out of this kind of line of thinking.
Thank you.
Could I?
Yes, please, Robert.
I think what we face today is these transnational terrorist groups do not have the freedom liberation movement anymore in the agenda actually there. Largely, you find that these groups are anti-statist and anti-government, which would like to overthrow all these states. And therefore, that is going to be a war from the groups, violent groups versus the states actually. So that calls in for a consensus in terms of dialogue among the states so that this threat is being addressed as a transnational challenge rather than a bilateral or a multilateral issue there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a very long-standing fundamental issue. I think Sri Lanka is chairing a working group at the United Nations in New York, trying to draft an international convention on terrorism. I think for the last several decades, one of the things that that has throttled that effort is to define who is a terrorist. The age-old problem of somebody's terrorist is somebody else's freedom fighter. I think that's a big problem. Any further questions? Well, I don't think I don't see any other plans going up. Perhaps lunchtime is also approaching. I think I would like to thank our distinguished panelists very much for this very thorough and very analytical, professional discussion and their presentations and your participation, and that certainly widened and enhanced our knowledge and provided us with great insights. So I thank you very much, the panelists, and I thank you, our participants, for your participation. So have a good lunch. Meeting is adjourned.